Welcome to Poopcast 4. This time we will deal with a war galley battle. We'll examine the battle in the Gulf of Patrai in 429 BC. This battle was fought between an Athenian force and a Corinthian fleet which was seeking to reinforce a Peloponnesian League expedition that was in trouble in northwestern Greece. Essentially, it was a blockading action, with the Corinthians trying to run an Athenian blockade of their city. In the spring of 429 BC, the Peloponnesian League tried to knock out the most distant of Athens' allies in northwestern Greece. ACARNANIA was remote from Athens and few Athenian forces were to hand. Athens was stricken with plague and short of crews for its TRIERES. How could they support such distant allies as the Acarnanians? The Peloponnesian League held more territory on the Greek mainland than did Athens. Athens' element was the water, and she gained most of her help and support from allies in the Aegean. In an attempt to throttle the naval capability and trade of Corinth, the principal naval member of the Peloponnesian League, the Athenians had established a naval force at NAUPAKTOS, near the mouth of the Crisaean Gulf, now called the Gulf of Corinth. Freighters coming into or leaving Corinth or Achaia or Theban territory were easily intercepted near the narrow strait at RHION. NAUPAKTOS was distant from Corinth and secure in friendly territory, while it allowed the RHION bottleneck to be guarded. Prior to the war, Corinth had a special way out to the Aegean via the Diolkos. This was a paved track which allowed ships and goods to be moved across the narrow isthmus into the Saronic Gulf and thence to the Aegean Sea. This was now useless in the face of Athens' maritime supremacy. As part of a campaign to eventually roll up the Athenian allies around NAUPAKTOS, the Peloponnesians sent a force to Acarnania. They seized the initiative in spring and moved rapidly to cross the Gulf of Patrai before the Athenians were alarmed by any intelligence. Unfortunately, the campaign did not go according to plan. The expeditionary force got into trouble and sent for help. The Peloponnesians had to reinforce their campaign in Acarnania. They decided to reinforce and start raiding the Acarnanian coast to distract and demoralize enemy resistance. But there were no forces readily available in the western Peloponnesus. While Sparta was trying to nurture its own navy in these first years of the war, as yet it had no pedigree of maritime skill. Corinth was a major maritime trading state and had a series of overseas colonies. Corinth would supply ships and men for the expedition. Let's have a look at the Corinthian fleet of 47 ships. There were 3 types of vessel according to Thucydides' account, maybe 4. There were 5 fast-sailing TRIERES. These were probably newly built ships which were not carrying troops, to allow them to make the most of their speed and manoeuvrability. Then there were some light or delicate ships. These were ships which could not stand up to ramming, presumably, and might have been PENTEKONTERES or TRIAKONTERES, which were carrying supplies. We do not know how many of them there were, but they were a minority, because they were protected by the more numerous TRIERES in the battle. We can guess at maybe a dozen. One problem we have is to know if Thucydides includes the lighter vessels in his total of 47 for the fleet. He may only be counting TRIERES when he compares the Corinthian fleet to the Athenians, because the lighter craft could not participate in a battle and would not logically be counted in a comparison with the Athenian force, which were all TRIERES. It makes more sense to consider the 47 ships mentioned in Thucydides to be 47 TRIERES. The light ships were most likely additional auxiliaries. This left the majority of the fleet, 42 ships, which were TRIERES. 3-tier war galleys with 1 man per oar, the fastest type of war galley. However, the mission of this fleet was to provide reinforcement for the Peloponnesians in Acarnania, and many of the ships, if not all, were carrying troops. Thucydides specifically comments that they were not aiming to fight a sea battle, and were rather fitted out as stratiotoi, or troop carriers. We should examine more closely what this disparaging remark meant, because it had serious implications for the oncoming engagement. Normally, a TRIERES carried a complement of deck fighters to defend the ship. They were known as passengers, and usually numbered a dozen or so spearmen and 4 archers. But carrying a large number of heavily equipped soldiers was quite a task for the lightly built TRIERES. Burdening a ship reduces freeboard as the ship settles deeper, making rowing difficult in choppy conditions, especially for the Thalamians, the lowest rowing tier. If the extra weight is high up in the ship, it reduces stability by raising the centre of gravity. The TRIERES is very sensitive to heeling if weight shifts to one side, and any passengers have to remain static throughout a voyage. Here are 2 calculated scenarios for carrying a body of troops. In the first, we have 30 men aboard a TRIERES, which is modified as little as possible to bear the weight. Even so, the loss of stability is substantial. This would not be acceptable in a high-performance ship. The ship could not safely enter combat against unburdened ships. In the second scenario, 100 men are crammed aboard. In this case, the ship becomes dangerously unstable if the men move around or if the ship turns sharply. This ship could not fight as a ramming ship or against unburdened TRIERES. These scenarios show that Thucydides well appreciated the limitations of a troop-carrying TRIERES. He had himself commanded ships in war. There were basically 3 solutions to carrying a substantial number of troops, and we might hazard a guess which option was chosen by the Corinthians and their allies. First, modifying the ship, perhaps only temporarily. Second, rebuilding the ship to create a troop carrier rather than a war galley. And third, fitting troops aboard with no serious modification. The first involves a technique known as girdling the hull. Adding layers of planking near the waterline, buoyancy is increased and so is stability. This could be done with cheap wood and is simple to do and reversible. This option still allows the ship to be put into a standard-sized ship shed over winter, but only if modified to take a maximum of 50 troops. This option could have been used if there was good time to carry out the work, but it seems the reinforcement plan was rather more hasty. The second option was a full rebuild of the hull. The hull could be rebuilt to give a broader ship and higher oar positions. This required skilled shipwrights and good quality materials. A hull rebuilt to accommodate 30 extra troops would still fit into a TRIERES ship shed, but only just. A hull modified to take 50 to 100 troops would result in a hull which could not fit into a standard TRIERES ship shed with a width limit of 5.6 metres or so, and it would no longer be a first-rate fighting war galley. It's unlikely this option was taken. Lastly, there are the crewing or manning solutions. The TRIERES already had to deal with its own epibatae. 30 or 50 more could have been squeezed aboard for a single trip, surely. There were 2 options. Either leave the Thalamians ashore, this is approximately 52 men. The hoplites could take their places, and being lower in the ship, the extra weight would not reduce stability so much. This would sacrifice any hope of mobile ramming combat with troops aboard. Once the troops were disembarked, the ship could reman the Thalamian tier. We do know that cavalry and troop transports were used as punishment postings for rowers in the Athenian navy. Rowing with just 2 or a single tier of oars in a burdened ship would be no picnic, especially as transport vessels probably had older hulls which were heavier in the water than newer ones. The other option was to strengthen the canopy and carry the troops on deck. This is where the deck soldiers were normally to be found during a voyage. The troops would be carefully marshalled to stay seated or reclining in the central portion of the canopy. This was not a heavy, fitted deck. Presumably, they would be allowed to throw up over the side when necessary. For my money, the last options would be used in what was a hastily arranged operation. Of course, there's nothing to say that a mix of these solutions was used amongst the various ships gathered for the expedition. The main point is that troop-carrying TRIERES were disadvantaged compared to fully able war galleys. They couldn't turn as quickly, they couldn't achieve anything like their maximum speed, they couldn't accelerate as rapidly as unburdened ships, and the shock of ramming, or being rammed, would cause chaos on a fully burdened ship with 100 or even with 50 hoplites as passengers. The Athenian fleet is a more simple proposition to examine. There were 20 TRIERES. This possibly equates with 2 units of 10, but we have no direct information on how the fleet was organised. These ships were all TRIERES in fighting trim. Athenian ships excelled in what was termed artful or scientific naval tactics, whereby the ram was the primary weapon and deck fighting was avoided. We may assume that all 20 Athenian ships were fast and well crewed, and carried the usual complement of a dozen or so epibattae and a few archers. The Corinthians had 2 main objectives. They had to get safely out of the Crisaean Gulf and then deliver their troops to the shores of ACARNANIA, whereafter the ships would raid the enemy coast in support of the land forces. The fleet sailed along the southern shore of the Gulf and neared NAUPAKTOS, where PHORMIO had his base. At 7 knots or so, the average speed for a war galley fleet making a passage, the fleet would sail past NAUPAKTOS on the 2nd day of its voyage. They would have overnighted at a safe port on the Achaean coast. The Gulf is just a few kilometres wide here, and they had no chance to slip by unnoticed in daylight. The Athenians spotted the enemy fleet and put to sea, but in the face of the difference in numbers, PHORMIO bided his time and just shadowed the Corinthian ships, each force following its own shore to the Straits of RHION. From here, the Corinthians made no attempt to cross the Gulf of Patrai to get to ACARNANIA. They stuck to their own shore and sailed south to harbour at Patrai, which they would reach at the end of their 2nd day's sailing. PHORMIO observed them sail into the harbour and then sent his 2 squadrons back to the shores of Aeolis to the north, one put in at Halkis and one at the mouth of the river Uranus. Both spots must have offered suitable places to eat and sleep in security, whilst 1 or more ships remained off Patrai as pickets to keep watch. The Corinthians had got their force safely past the Athenian base of NAUPAKTOS and safely out of the narrows at the mouth of the Crisaean Gulf. Now, all they had to do was to get over the Gulf of Patrai and safely northward. PHORMIO had let an opportunity pass, apparently. He might have tried to attack the Peloponnesians while they were strung out along the coast. He might have tried to stand across the RHION Strait and dispute the exit of the enemy fleet. Why did he let them get safely to Patrai? PHORMIO's worst option was to get closely entangled with a larger fleet that was bristling with troops. In narrow waters, his ships could get trapped and blocked by the more numerous enemy, who could overwhelm his epibattae in deck fighting. The Athenians could still win in such a battle, but PHORMIO was seeking total defeat of the enemy, and he had to avoid losses to his small fleet, which still had to remain on station afterwards and fulfill its blockading role. PHORMIO already had a plan that would come to fruition the next day. He counted on the Peloponnesians' desperation to reach ACARNANIA, and he had local knowledge which would prove vital to trapping the enemy in a situation where his more seaworthy war galleys would triumph. In Patrai, the Peloponnesians made ready to run past the Athenians. Maybe they were emboldened by the failure of the enemy to stop them when they were vulnerable at the Strait of RHION. In any case, they were safe in port and now needed to cross the Gulf. The weather was probably perfect for crossing the 50 kilometres or so, which would, within a day's rowing, see them on the Acarnanian coast. Such perfect weather would be seen as the best opportunity to sail directly over and avoid coasting round a longer route shadowed by the Athenians. Even before sunrise, about 6:30 in late summer, the Peloponnesian fleet was assembling outside Patrai. At this point, Phormio's picket would have noticed activity and set out to warn their side at full speed. A fast TRIERES could cross 15 kilometres of sea in far less than 2 hours, as signalled to their side while out at sea. In 2 hours from the first light, the Peloponnesians could have been organised and setting out across the Gulf of Patrai, unaware that their counterparts had also set out from the other side to rendezvous with them on the open sea. The perfect weather was also a factor which gave Phormio the confidence to let the enemy fleet go into Patrai unopposed. He knew he could set a picket in good visibility, and there would be no problem signalling or rowing between his other units to communicate. Once at sea, the enemy fleet would also be visible on the calm sea in clear morning light. Visibility from a TRIERES deck to spot another TRIERES is about 9 kilometres. If a man is placed up the mast, this increases to 13 kilometres. The Gulf of Patrai is not 20 kilometres wide near Patrai, so with an offshore picket, or with one each side of the Gulf, Phormio could easily keep watch for his prey leaving harbour and signal. The Peloponnesians got their fleet out of Patrai, organised and underway across the Gulf even while the sun was coming up. The 3 strategoi, or the one in command that day, must have had a plan as how they would achieve their channel dash, and it hinged on 2 things. Firstly, they would cross at top speed in good weather before the Athenians were ready for them. Secondly, if caught, they would face off against the much smaller enemy force, who would back down as they had the previous day. They achieved as much surprise as they could by getting underway early. The second aspect begs some analysis, because what happened when the forces engaged indicates forethought. A major factor was that the fleet of 46 ships included vessels which had differing cruising speeds. The unencumbered TRIERES could make 7.5 knots for hours on end. The stratiotoi, on the other hand, could probably only sustain 5, maybe 6. On top of this, the light or delicate ships, which were TRIAKONTERES or PENTEKONTERES, could only sustain 4 or 5 knots. This meant the whole force had to proceed at 4.5 knots, say, to avoid being strung out and divided. At this rate, the crossing would take 5 or 6 hours to put the Peloponnesian fleet beyond Athenian-friendly coast. This same variation among the fleet's vessels meant that should it come to a fight, the burdened TRIERES and the light ships would be at a great disadvantage to the Athenian war-galleys. A plan had to be devised to deal with this, and the way the Corinthian commanders reacted to the enemy shows they had devised one. A similar tactic was famously used by the Greek fleet in the first battle around Artemisium in 480 BC, when Xerxes' massive navy was frustrated in attempts to wipe out the assembled Hellenic fleet. But here, that formation was modified. The key to the plan was that the majority of the TRIERES should form a circle and present their ram-armed bows to the enemy outside the circle. Within the protective ring of rams would be the vulnerable ships. In addition, the 5 best war galleys would be retained, ready to reinforce any part of the ring threatened by the enemy. The trick was how to get 40-odd galleys into such a formation on the open sea without telegraph or walkie-talkies. There was no question that the force could sail along in this formation. Small variations in ship speeds or wind would rapidly produce a ragged flock of vessels unable to hold station perfectly the whole way across the Gulf. No, the key was some sailing formation which could, at a signal, transform into the defensive circle. No fleet of ships tries to sail in ranks. They rapidly become distorted and chaotic as vessels try to accelerate and decelerate to maintain position. The ships must sail in files. Several files would give the separate parts of the fleet a chance to manoeuvre into their composite formation when signalled. The core of the circle was to be the light ships. They must have led in file, because it was their speed which dictated that of the whole fleet. To either side would be a file of 20 TRIERES. They screened the light ships as the force was underway, and would be ready to form each half of the enclosing ring when commanded. The remaining file would be the fast ships. They could usefully form the vanguard, and with their extra available speed could scout ahead or fall back to enter the circle when required. So the Peloponnesian fleet must have looked something like this as it set out across the Gulf of Patrai. The sun shone brightly behind them as it rose higher. The water was as blue as the clear sky, and there was little or no wind. The only sound was the rhythmic swoosh of 6,000 oars sending the galleys onward. The weather was perfect for rowing, little wind and a flat sea, or the Corinthians would not have been so bold as to cross the Gulf directly. This meant it was also perfect for Athenian observation and Athenian rowing. Phormio got word almost as soon as the Corinthians were preparing to leave port and got his squadrons out into the Gulf. He did not wait to ambush the enemy near the coast. He wanted to meet them in open water off the coast. It is unlikely he had any idea of the circle formation plan. He probably hoped to meet an enemy fleet strung out over the water, which his better commanded and crewed ships would wear down in a running fight. At some point, the Corinthians saw the Athenians coming towards them from the north, and the engagement began. First light is about 6 a.m. in September in the Patrai region. The forces must have approached each other sometime around 10. The forces probably met south of the mouth of the Euxinus River. As the fast Athenian TRIERES began to overhaul and head off their enemies, the Corinthian commanders signalled their ships to take up the defensive circle. The sea was calm, and the fleet took up their planned positions without interference from the Athenians, who must have watched somewhat bemused by the sudden evolutions of the larger enemy force. If the various files of ships knew their part in the plan, then taking up the defensive formation could have taken well less than an hour. Here is the Peloponnesian fleet in its files. We have the left-hand file of TRIERES, some loaded, some unloaded. We have the right-hand file of TRIERES. Then we have the small ships, the delicate ships, safe between the two files. Then we have the small squadron of fast TRIERES. And then we have the ship which actually dictates the speed of the whole formation, the single leading TRIAKONTERES or PENTEKONTERES, dictates the speed of the whole formation. We can now see what happens when the fleet slows to adopt its defensive formation. The light ships begin to group together. At the same time, the TRIERES flank files turn to cross each other. The fast squadron keeps a guarding position. The flanks proceed to trace out the circle around the light ships. When the formation is complete, it is about 700 meters across. There is about a ship length between vessels. This spacing gives enough room for ships to maneuver and hold station without hampering their neighbours. At the same time, the fast ships can freely move around inside the ring to offer help wherever it is needed. The Athenians were free to sail round the circle and observe what they were up against. The circle presented a tactical challenge, which would be a tough nut to crack. We can examine how it works in more detail. The expected way for TRIERES to attack an enemy line was to carry out the diekplos manoeuvre. This meant sailing through the line, but the neighbours to any breakthrough could counterattack. Any ship which entered the circle could also expect to meet a counterattack from the fast TRIERES stationed inside. But the circle had some disadvantages. It was a relatively passive stance. If a lone trierarch dared to attack the enemy's flank, then they would themselves fall prey. The Athenian TRIERES were faster and could turn away to evade. This left any daring Peloponnesian ship out on a limb, asking to be attacked. As long as the Athenians kept a safe distance away from the circle, they could never be hit by one of the heavier TRIERES trying to attack them from a standing start while they were already moving. As long as the Athenians patrolled round the circle, they could present a continuous threat, which kept the Peloponnesians in their formation. However, the same formation of ready and waiting rams, so long as it was unbroken, prevented the Athenians from making any conclusive attack upon it. The Peloponnesians were now locked into their circle formation, and the Athenians were limited to their circumnavigation. They could sweep in to threaten places where ships drifted too far apart and cause a little panic, but they had no real chance of breaking in and breaking apart the resolute ring of prows presented to them. Instead of allowing his trierarchs a free hand to try and attack, though, Phormio kept them in hand as he waited for the best chance to break the enemy fleet. The Athenian strategos had been stationed around RHION for some time now, and he had learnt the peculiarities of local sea and weather conditions. The Corinthian commanders had sailed from their waters over 100 kilometres away, and had no inkling that the perfect conditions which allowed their early start across the Gulf, and which gave them a smooth sea to form their circle defence, would soon betray them. Machaon, Isocrates, and Agatharchidas must have believed it was only a matter of time before the Athenians recognised the impasse and sailed away. This clear, warm weather is typical for late summer in the Gulf of Patrai. The night had been clear also, and this gave the early dawn light that allowed the Peloponnesians to leave harbour early. But the clear skies also meant the sea and land had cooled overnight. The land cools more rapidly, and there was now an effect created as it was warmed again by the morning sun. Warm air rose above the heated land and began to draw heavier air in from over the cooler, deep Gulf waters. The high mountains surrounding the narrow Gulf drew more air in from the Ionian Sea as strong thermals developed on their flanks. A strong onshore breeze developed, running into the Gulf. The wind began to rise and immediately presented the regular Peloponnesian formation with problems. Ships lying with the wind on their beam would start to drift downwind. This is hard to correct by rowing without moving off station. Ships with the wind on the bow or the stern would also be affected, but could better maintain position by slow rowing ahead or astern. Those in between would have their own special challenge to stay in the circle. Inside the formation, the light ships began to be pushed downwind towards one side of the circle. As the wind rose, and onshore breezes in clear weather can reach almost gale levels, the Peloponnesian ships began to fall foul of each other. Tempers frayed, and ships had to fend each other off to avoid collision. The formidable circle began to look more like a cluster of confused craft. This was what Phormio had waited for, and he now set his ships loose to attack. Each trierarch continued their progress of hemming in the enemy until they saw a gap or a ship's stern presented, and then went in for a ramming attack. They could easily back away and escape before the slower and disordered enemy could make any response. A TRIERES holed by a ram will settle so far in the water within 10 minutes that the Thalamian oars become unworkable. The fleet had many ships laden by heavily armed hoplites who could probably not even swim. The wind and waves made rowing difficult even for undamaged ships. This was a recipe for panic and flight. The Peloponnesian commander, or one of them, was one of the first victims. No doubt he had a recognisable ship, and once his fate was known, it was sauve qui peut for the rest of the fleet. Athenian TRIERES made ramming attacks as they drove into the crowd like predators attacking a ball of baitfish from different directions. Ship after ship was holed, and they could make no defence. The Peloponnesians scattered over the gulf and made their way to safety as best they could. PHORMIO's 20 vessels hunted and chased and harried them all the way. The defeated fleet took refuge either in Patrai, where they had so optimistically sailed forth earlier that day, or they went south to Dyme. In the following days they took further south and gathered in Elis, where they met the remnants of the ACARNANIan expedition. This had already been beaten, even as the reinforcement attempt was being made. The Athenians took 12 ships. Even a holed ship could be towed or rowed to shore, as the light hulls would not sink. The action took place so far out in the Gulf that the crews could neither wade nor swim to safety, and they and any hoplites were taken with their ships. Unlike the Spartans, who were in the habit of massacring any Athenians captured at sea and burying them in unmarked pits, these men probably faced slavery, but remained alive. PHORMIO sailed triumphantly back to RHION and set up a trophy, which was easily visible mocking the Peloponnesian side of the strait. He also dedicated a ship to Poseidon, probably by sinking or burning it. There was no doubting the scale of his victory on the day. All Peloponnesian naval forces were chased away. The small Athenian fleet was in command of the sea. But what did the victory achieve? In fact, it achieved little. It was simply a successful blockading action. The captured ships could not be used. No men were available to crew them. The Peloponnesians could eventually muster more ships to replace them. Peloponnesian morale had taken a beating, but they were the underdogs at sea in any case. Like any brave but unsupported commander, PHORMIO remained one defeat away from disaster, while the enemy marshalled superior forces to try again and again, as long as they thought it was worthwhile to do so. And the campaigning season of 429 BC was not yet over.